Sometimes it's nice to relax and unwind with a colouring book. Thomas and Friends, as one might expect, is no stranger to such publications, with some of the earliest ones predating the TV series entirely. Famous Engines was a series of colouring and activity books released during the 1970s. And today I thought I'd colour in some of the illustrations from one of these books, but with a twist. What's the twist? Well, you'll find out if you keep watching. So, what I'm going to be doing is colouring 3 drawings, but use fewer colours for each new one. That's the twist. For this first illustration, I'm using a palette of 30 colours, so I've got quite a selection. The rules are that I can blend the palette colours, but cannot go to the colour wheel to pick new ones that are not present in the palette. The palette I'm using lacks yellow, although it does have oranges and greens that I can use to substitute. A lot of the illustrations in the Famous Engines books are redraws of scenes from the Railway series, but I figured that it would be more interesting to colour some of the ones that are original. This one depicts James arranging trucks in a goods yard, a scene that we have seen in the Railway series more than once. But the composition of this particular piece is noticeably different to the ones we've seen in the past. This illustration from the colouring book is followed up by a series of illustrations similar to those from the story Troublesome Trucks, perhaps suggesting that this is a retelling of that story. But the illustration of James in the yard is from a completely different viewpoint. Similar to what I do with my original drawings, I began by colouring the environment first, with the vehicles coming later. Given that the signal in the foreground is facing James, I made sure to colour it white, since only the side facing the train should be painted red. The palette I chose has some interesting hues, meaning that the red is a little more pinkish than you'd usually expect for James, but I think this makes for an intriguing look. Come to think of it, most of the palette has a bit of a pinkish or purplish hue to it. You'll notice that I used lilac as a substitute for grey for things like the roofs of the buildings and some of the trucks. I'm not entirely sure where this goods yard is supposed to be, but I ended up embellishing the background a little bit by adding some grass, shrubs and trees. The end result resembles a goods yard that appears to be somewhere in the middle of the line, as opposed to a terminus station. It's perhaps not accurate to the Railway series lore, but I think it looks quite good, and that's what matters. And so, here is the original black and white illustration, and here it is with a splash of colour. After completing a piece with 30 colours, it was time to downsize. The palette I'm using for this piece has a mere 10 colours, which are mostly just reds, blues and yellows, and oranges as well. I must point out, incidentally, that I'm also colour picking from the line art for when I need a black or a dark grey. Since black is the absence of colour rather than a colour in and of itself, I personally wouldn't call this cheating, but different people might have different opinions on that. At the end of the day, I'm still pulling from what I already have and not selecting a brand new colour. This scene depicts Thomas and Bertie. Bertie only appeared in 2 stories in the Railway series, and neither of them involve goods trains, so you know that this is an original piece created specifically for the colouring book. It looks as though Thomas has taken on some bad coal recently, which Bertie helpfully points out as we can see in the caption. "Oh, Thomas, that's some smoky coal you're using today," he says, as Thomas presumably replies, "Oh, well done, genius, I could have figured that out myself." Given that this palette mainly, or should I say primarily, consists of primary colours, I figured that I could easily get green from mixing blue and yellow. I don't know if these particular shades of blue and yellow don't mix very well, or if Sketchbook's brushes don't mix the colours the same way that actual paint would. But I noticed that the resulting colour ended up looking more like grey than anything else. It wasn't too bad, however, partially because I ended up using spots of yellow and blue on top of the grey foliage for highlights and shading, but also because a lack of colour can sometimes give off the illusion of a colour if surrounded by other, often opposing colours. I'm sure many of you have seen that picture of the Coke can that looks red despite the image itself consisting entirely of white and cyan noise. Either way, I think I managed to make the grass, trees and shrubs look convincingly green despite not having any green to work with. The more limited number of colours appears to have resulted in a higher contrast image compared to the first. It meant that a lot of the objects and surfaces used the same colour, such as the road and ballast both being a bright yellow, and the bridge, houses, trucks and cuttings all being a very pronounced orange hue. It certainly results in a very distinct colouring style that sets this image apart from most of the illustrations I've done on this channel. But, with all that said, here is the original black and white image, and here it is after being coloured in. Now is the time for the biggest of the three challenges, which also happens to have the smallest colour palette. Some may say that that's what makes it the biggest challenge. This palette consists of 2 reds, 2 greens and a light yellow or cream colour, basically the colours you might associate with an apple. This illustration depicts Bertie once again, this time with duck. This illustration has always interested me for 2 reasons. The first is that it depicts a scene that wouldn't happen in real life. No, I'm not talking about the fact that the vehicles have faces. I'm referring to the fact that the train is waiting for the bus to cross, when in reality the trains always have right of way at a level crossing. This is something that has always irked me a little about the TV series in particular. They've been doing it since season 2, but it really became annoying in the later CGI seasons, where it got to a point where it almost seemed like it was happening approximately once every episode. The other reason this illustration interests me is because it reminds me quite a lot of the TV series episode All at Sea. The scene where Duck delivers the injured sailor to Bertie so that he can take him to hospital almost resembles a mirror image of this illustration. All at Sea was the first Thomas and Friends episode that was completely original, not based on either an Audrey story or a magazine story. Were Britt and David inspired by this specific illustration from an old colouring book? Almost certainly not, but it's interesting to think about. Because this palette is basically just reds and greens, I can't make the sky blue, so the sky is more of a reddish hue, perhaps implying an evening scene. I'm sure all the shepherds on Sodor will be delighted. One challenge I was faced with was making sure that the trees and shrubs didn't clash with Duck, since, both are green. I think I managed to pull it off, mainly by using the light yellow to add highlights on the foreground shrub, and using a dark red for the trees in the distance to indicate that they're far away. And, with that said and done, here is the original colouring page, and here it is after colouring has occurred. And there we are. 3 pages from an old Railway Series colouring book, given a bit of life in the form of colour. I think I was able to do these illustrations justice, and it was a fun challenge to limit the number of colours I could use for each illustration. Perhaps I could do more videos like this with other pages from the book using other colouring book challenges. I haven't used a colouring book in a long time, and this was quite a therapeutic experience, so I'd certainly be up for doing something similar in the future. But for now, that's all I've got time for, so I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe so you don't miss what I've got in store for next time.